Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Alexandre Caweth. I'm a master's student at the University of New Brunswick. Here I'm studying the movement and population dynamics of the emerald ash borer. Today I'll be talking about some of my master's work, which uses network modeling to measure the dispersal of the emerald ash borer through firewood movement. With this project, I'm modeling the probability and time of emerald ash borer establishment into campgrounds to better understand how introduction events affect emerald ash borer establishment. So the emerald ash borer is an invasive buprestid, which was first introduced into North America through shipping packages in the early to mid 1990s. Since its introduction, it's caused large-scale damage to urban ash trees, like this street in Ohio that saw full ash death in 3 years, as well as forests like this mixedwood forest stand in Ontario. The emerald ash borer is small but very capable of killing ash trees because the larvae feed on phloem and xylem of the tree, and due to a lack of host defenses, can attack in very large numbers. It's estimated that the emerald ash borer has killed about 99% of ash trees in the epicenter of where the emerald ash borer was first established. So this can be a really big problem because the emerald ash borer has been very successful at expanding its range, despite the fact that the emerald ash borer actually disperses on average through its own flight about only a half a kilometer a year. However, it's actually been capable of dispersing over 1,500 kilometers, pretty much in all directions from the location of first introduction in less than 20 years. And this is mainly due to human dispersal or human-aided dispersal movement through firewood, nursery stocks, forestry wood, and other wood-related products. This right here is a map of emerald ash borer detections from 2002 to 2020. Each different square represents the detection or the first detection made to that county, and it was usually to a city within that county. Each color represents the different year, where our 2002 is our light pink and our dark brown is 2020. And so here I just want to highlight a few of these long distance dispersal events. To start, we have Denver, Colorado, which is really far outside of any other detections. We have Longview, Texas. If we go to Canada, we can see Winnipeg, Manitoba, and we have the Maritimes here in Canada. And so once these long distance dispersal events occur, oftentimes there will be smaller dispersal events that happen. This is often due to campers moving firewood to campgrounds. And currently there are no studies that look at the movement of emerald ash borer into the Maritimes. So with human-assisted movement of invasive species, there are often certain density-dependent mechanisms that can limit population growth when the species is first introduced. This is called the Allee effect. This is where population growth is actually negative below a certain population size due to things like being able to find a mate. And in our case, with things like firewood transportation, oftentimes it can be like the fact that a single piece of firewood may not actually be enough to surpass that threshold, and it may require multiple introductions to surpass that threshold for populations to be able to find mates. For other invasive beetle species, there have been genetic studies that have shown evidence that multiple introductions likely occurred. And for the emerald ash borer, which has a very cryptic development and can be very difficult to detect before populations are established, it's really important that we understand how emerald ash borer introduction events lead to establishment, because this remains understudied. And so the goal of my research is kind of understand how multiple introduction events play a role in emerald ash borer establishment. And to do this, I create a network model that measures firewood movement by campers into campgrounds in the Maritimes. So to understand how likely emerald ash borer is to establish, we first need to understand how people move firewood and how often it occurs. For this, we need to define the likelihood that the emerald ash borer first arrives in an area and then establishes into that new area. So for the emerald ash borer to arrive, it first needs to be transported, and then populations need to be high enough so that the population can establish. The way that we understand transportation is just the likelihood that an infested piece of firewood arrives at that campground, which is represented by a network model, which I'll be talking about in a bit. And then the probability that the emerald ash borer becomes established is being looked at using a sensitivity analysis to measure how important the establishment threshold is and why that establishment threshold kind of matters. So to collect our data, we use data on New Brunswick camper trends from provincial campgrounds in New Brunswick to extrapolate a linear relationship of a per capita number of reservations per year based on a city's population. We then collected the populations of all the cities in the Maritimes that had populations greater than 5,000 people. We then collected information on private, municipal, provincial, and national campgrounds, including the number of campsites at each location and their geographic location. Then using that geographic location, we'd measure the distance from our city to our campground based on the shortest road distance traveled. Then using this data, we would calculate the number of infested firewood pieces leaving a single population center by multiplying our city's population size by the probability that a single piece of firewood is transported from outside and contains live borers, and the per capita number of reservations. Then we would measure the attractants of the campground, and we would have we would measure this by dividing the number of campgrounds of the destination by an exponential decay fitted relationship of the distance between our origin location and our destination location. Then using that propagular pressure, we would then distribute infested pieces of firewood to campgrounds at random, but weighted on their attractants values. So to give an example of this, let's take a city like Halifax, which would have a set number of infested pieces of firewood leaving that area. Those would then be distributed to all the campgrounds based on those attractants values, so based on the size of the campground and the distance that the campground has to Halifax. Then additionally, to add some stochasticity to the model, each year a new city would become infested, which was selected at random based on the population size of that location and the amount of travel based on a county-to-county Canadian statistics survey called the Travel Survey Residents of Canada. We then take that model and run this for a set number of years and a set number of iterations. So our initial time point of this model considers 5 cities that already have established populations of emerald ash borer. The first is Halifax, then Moncton, Fredericton, Edmundston, and Oromocto. And so this here is an example of a single iteration of our model going from infested locations to non-infested locations over a 20-year period. And this includes our 3 maritime provinces. Each point here either represents a city or campground, and our different colors here represent either infested in red or susceptible, not yet infested, in gray. And right here, we can see this is just that little animation of running for that 20-year period. So if we take that model and then repeat it for 100 different iterations during our 50-year period, we get this line chart. And this line chart represents the proportion of locations with established population of emerald ash borer over a 50-year period. And then further separated by a different establishment threshold. So the number of pieces of firewood required before a location becomes infested. And so on the y-axis here, we can see the proportion of locations that have established populations of emerald ash borer. And on the x-axis, we have years going to a maximum of 50. Each line, like I mentioned, represents a different establishment threshold required so that a population can establish. And so here we can just generally see that there's kind of this proportion of establishment that follows a saturating exponential curve as time progresses. We can also see that when we increase establishment threshold, that just decreases the overall proportion of locations with established populations. So if we were to actually visualize this differently, we could look at the establishment threshold over a single simulation time, like if we were to look at that over a 10-year period. So again, here on the y-axis, we have the proportion of locations with an established population of emerald ash borer. However, on the x-axis, we actually now see the establishment threshold, or the number of infested pieces of firewood required for populations to become established. Now here we see this kind of logistic decay relationship where the slope slowly increases as establishment threshold increases. Once we reach our inflection point, which is about 9, our establishment threshold of 9, that slope continues to slowly decrease. And one general trend that we can see here is that just the proportion of locations with established populations is extremely high at about 90% here when we have a single establishment threshold, and about as low as 20% when we have about 21 pieces needed for a location to establish. So we are still in the early stages of interpreting this model, but I think there are some key takeaways that we can get from this model. The first is that this model tells us what it means for the establishment of emerald ash borer in response to things like introduction events. This would mean that multiple introduction events will influence the proportion of locations with emerald ash borer establishment. This would mean that if we could expect less than 50% of locations having established populations in a 10-year period, it would require that there are multiple introductions that occur in a single year at one location before that population establishes. Secondly, we have a rapid change in the proportion of locations with an established population when the emerald ash borer threshold reaches approximately 9 introduction events for the establishment. This could mean that there are a lot of campgrounds receiving just a moderate number of infested pieces of firewood, and that there are only few campgrounds receiving less than 5 pieces and more than 15 pieces of wood per year. And so this is still an ongoing project, and we are hoping to add to this model and to continue working on some of these questions of emerald ash borer population dispersal and establishment. And so we'd like to add some data on ash tree cover into the model to more accurately display the risk of emerald ash borer introduction. We'd also like to look at the synchronicity of the arrival of wood in a year and to see whether inter-arrival time may influence establishment rates. And then to better understand timing of firewood, we would just measure differences between arriving early firewood versus late season firewood. And then additionally, to kind of bolster this work, further studies should look into doing some kind of genetic analysis to see what happens with newly established populations of emerald ash borer, kind of better understand what is the result of multiple introductions into places where emerald ash borer is already established. And so I'd like to thank the members of my committee for their invaluable feedback, lab members for their support with this project, and funders. This project would not be possible without funders and the organizations that have helped provide data for this and other projects. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. And if we have time, I would certainly love to take questions.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Sam Reed. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. And today we're going to be talking about how canopy gaps and deer influence invasive earthworms in northern forests. The alternate title for this talk is The Good, the Bad, and the Unguli. So feel free to listen to that soundtrack while we talk and build to our epic conclusion. So as most of you know, disturbances change temperate forests and pretty much all other ecosystems. They are incredibly important for us to understand, especially in a period of global change and rising temperatures. And today we're going to be talking about 3 common disturbances. The first is canopy gaps, the second is white-tailed deer, and then the third are invasive earthworms. And each of these disturbances has pretty unique effects on a forest ecosystem. So canopy gaps, when a tree falls, it tends to lead to increased understory light that stimulates plant growth and can increase biodiversity. Deer they're incredibly damaging throughout most of the eastern portion of North America. They've just eat so much plant material that they eventually reduce biodiversity, can change wildlife habitat, and influence soil dwelling biota. And then lastly, we have invasive earthworms. So when earthworms are introduced into soils that they haven't been historically present in, they can radically alter soils through mixing the soil, eating leaf litter, throwing off nutrient dynamics, eating seeds. And all of the forests that we're talking about today haven't historically had earthworms prior to European colonization. But when we're thinking about these disturbances, we have to remember that they don't occur in vacuums. Disturbances overlap, and they can facilitate one another or be linked. So a linked disturbance is when one disturbance facilitates another. And there's been a lot of effort to understand certain linked disturbances, such as when like a blowdown increases fuel for an eventual fire. But in eastern temperate forests, linked disturbances have not gotten enough attention. Even though when disturbances are linked, their effects can really be magnified and highly influential. And there's several lines of evidence that canopy gaps, deer, and earthworms are linked together. Gaps can influence deer and earthworms, while other studies have shown that deer can increase earthworms. But the jury is still kind of out on these connections. Nobody, and along with that, nobody has really tested the combined influence of deer and gaps on earthworms. So that's kind of what we set out to do. And our first hypothesis was that deer would increase earthworms. And I'm not going to get into the mechanisms as to how this might happen just yet, but we will get into it. And then our second hypothesis is that gaps increase deer by increasing the amount of biomass growing in the understory, and then deer increase earthworms. And then our third hypothesis is that gaps and deer synergistically increase earthworms. So in order to test these hypotheses, we used two long-term canopy gap and deer exposure experiments in northern Wisconsin. Both of them have been around since about 2006 and factorially manipulate canopy gaps and deer exposures. The first experiment is the managed old growth silviculture study. And basically the setup of this study is there's 3 sites and a bunch of 24-meter canopy gaps spread out through those sites. And there's small 5¼ by 5¼ meter exclosures inside of the gaps. And then there's fences that are under a closed canopy as well. And what we did was we sampled earthworms inside of fences and outside at each potential location. And then we also used a very similar experiment that was also in northern Wisconsin, but kind of has the treatments inverted. So 22-meter canopy gaps, but the deer fencing goes around the entirety of the gap. So what we did was we sampled earthworms along a north to south transect across the gap. So we were able to see how distance from the gap and how distance from the gap really influences earthworms, and if that interacts with fencing and deer presence. And interestingly, earthworms were actually sampled in 2006 in this site as well. So we were kind of able to get a long-term perspective on how gaps and deer are influencing invasive earthworms and how they might be, whether their influences are linked over the long term. The way that we sampled earthworms was the highly technologically complex method of dumping powdered mustard on the ground and waiting for earthworms to come shooting to the surface. After a little over 15 minutes, we collected, well, as worms came up, we collected the worms, we preserved them, and then took them back to the lab to be weighed, counted, and identified the species. In all, we sampled around 3,000 earthworms across all the sites. So it was a ton of work to get to that point. And within the first experiment, this is the moss experiment with the smaller exclosures, we found mixed support for our hypotheses. Note that the diamonds represent means, whereas the bars represent medians in these box plots. So we found that deer are increasing earthworm biomass, which does support our first hypothesis. And in contrast, the second hypothesis, we actually found that canopy gap creation caused a substantial reduction in earthworm biomass and density. And you look at these results and many of the ones that are to come, and people's first question tends to be, okay, so what is the mechanism behind these effects? And interestingly, all of the soil metrics and variables that we collected didn't shake out as being particularly explanatory, particularly soil moisture and soil temperature. None of them were important. But I think that we can gain some insight as to mechanisms here when we look at which genera were influenced by the disturbances. So we see that deer increase the larger soil-dwelling earthworms. So that'd be Operectidea and Lumbricus. And that could mean that, in my mind, I think it means that deer are influencing the soil somehow, potentially by increasing nutrients with fecal matter, or by consuming above ground plants, which then leads to a resource shift below ground or potentially increased microbial growth. So maybe some type of indirect effect of deer on earthworms. And then for canopy gap creation, we see that litter dependent earthworms are quite influenced by gaps. So I think that this means that you're getting a reduction in moist leaf litter for food and cover when there's a canopy gap, and that leads to fewer Dendrobana and Lumbricus species. So kind of shifting gears to the Flambeau experiment, which is where the fencing went all the way around the canopy gap. And we sampled along that north to south transect. We see super similar results. We're seeing greater earthworm density outside of fencing and lower earthworm density towards the center of a gap. And in that diagram on the left, those little yellow dots represent each location we sampled earthworms in relative to the center of the gap. And the most important thing to note is that in the center of the gap, we're getting much lower mean earthworm density in fenced locations as opposed to the center of gaps that are unfenced and have deer presence. So that shows that there is some potential interaction between gap location and deer, and that these effects might be generalizable. And shifting gears a bit to the historic earthworm data in this experiment, we see that earthworm population density was lower outside of exclosures in 2006. And by 2019, earthworm density outside of exclosures had increased by 72%. Whereas in the 13 years inside of the fencing, earthworm density only increased about 14%. So basically the thing to look at here is between those red diamonds, there's a big jump, but between the white diamonds, not so much. Shows that deer might take a little bit of time to influence earthworms. And then going back to the gap location question, we see the greatest increase in earthworms over time in the unlogged north buffer. So that's that red box, and that is the furthest point away from the center of a gap. And you see the biggest increase in earthworm density. Whereas in the center of a gap, you see a small decrease in earthworms over time. So really, both of these disturbances likely have a combined effect on earthworm populations in North American forests. So what does all of this mean? It means common disturbances in temperate forests can be linked. We just have to be willing, or we have to look for that. Deer increase invasive earthworms, and canopy gaps seem to decrease them. From a management perspective, this could have pretty big implications. It means that we could potentially unlink disturbances in order to control uncontrollable invasional disturbances. So we could potentially reduce deer populations and slow down earthworm invasion. We could selectively harvest and potentially slow down earthworm invasion. By breaking those links, we might be able to better manage our forests. An even bigger picture within these sites, deer and earthworms and gaps likely have a pretty big effect on plant life. So in this stand, you see how there's very few trees in the understory in a big sedgy lawn. So this is likely due to the influence of deer and earthworms. We're not entirely sure yet. That's going to be the next paper, so keep an eye out, I suppose. But the important thing to note here is there's very few trees in the understory. So in my mind, I think the resilience of this system might be quite low if those overstory trees were not replaced. So thank you for listening. Thank you to my advisors, all the various sponsors, everyone along the way. And please, please, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or ideas. I will respond as quick as I can.
My name is Anusha Higgins. I'm currently a master's student at the University of Vermont, and today I'm going to be talking about some of my master's thesis research about the impacts of emerald ash borer management on northern hardwood forest dynamics in New England in the US. So, invasive pests are a major issue in the United States and more broadly, New England forests. And as you can see in this map, they're especially concentrated in the northeastern US. And because our North American species aren't as well as adapted to deal with these pests, they can be much more destructive than native ones. This map uses data from 2012, so there are even more pests around these days. But one of the most devastating pests, which I'll be talking about today, is the emerald ash borer, or EAB. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this pest, and also Alex did a great job talking about it earlier in the session. So very briefly, EAB is originally from Eastern Asia, and it was first discovered in North America in Michigan in 2002, although we now believe that it's been here since the 1990s. It attacks and kills ash trees, and all North American ash species are susceptible to varying degrees. And by now, EAB isn't just in Michigan, it's spread to over 35 US states and 5 Canadian provinces, including more recently to the New England states through vectors such as the firewood movement that Alex was talking about. And the counties where EAB has been detected as of last year are shown on this map on the right. And the impacts of EAB are multifaceted. So ecologically, it's not just killing ash trees, although that's a big part of it, but there are ripple effects throughout the ecosystem. For example, one study in Michigan found that forests hit hard by EAB had more invasive plants colonizing the areas where ash trees had been located. Economically, it's expensive to treat or remove or replace so many ash trees, especially in urban areas. One study in 2010 estimated that these costs would exceed $10 billion, and the area that EAB has invaded is now larger than what that study projected. And socially and culturally, black ash in particular is a really important cultural resource to several indigenous tribes who use black ash wood for traditional basket making, among other things. So there's a lot motivating people to address this issue. But one aspect of EAB's impacts that we know less about is how people are managing forests in response to or in anticipation of EAB, and how those management responses are affecting both ash and its surrounding natural communities. So for a while, the phloem reduction technique of cutting down the largest ash trees because they have the most real estate for EAB was promoted. But in areas where EAB was not an immediate or present threat, that didn't end up really reducing EAB populations. It mostly just reduced ash populations. And more recently, there's been more of an effort to promote ash regeneration, since the future of ash in North America isn't quite as dire as we once thought. Some individuals termed lingering ash have been able to resist death by EAB for longer periods of time. And if we cut down all this ash before giving the lingering ash a chance to survive, we're losing the genetic diversity that may hold the key to EAB resistant ash in North America. So one point to keep in mind is that the management of a forest pest can have a different impact than the pest itself. So what do we know about this issue? We know about the direct impacts of EAB on ash trees and the communities they're in. We know about the impacts of management for other invasive pests, such as the hemlock woolly adelgid, which has some similarities to EAB. And several studies have predicted that the effects of have predicted the effects of management for EAB on the broader forest community using surveys and models. But what we don't have as much of is information about the management strategies that are actually happening, already being enacted on the landscape, and what impacts those practices are having on our forests. So that's one of the questions that I'm trying to answer. And today I'll be focusing on the future of our forests by looking at the impact of these management practices on regeneration. So to summarize, one of the goals of my study is to quantify the effects of management practices intended to mitigate EAB impacts on New England forests. And to accomplish that, I sampled northern hardwood and rich northern hardwood forests throughout New England, which contain a relatively small but significant component of primarily white ash. So when I talk about ash throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll be talking about white ash. So some of those forests had been harvested in response to or in anticipation of EAB, and others had not recently been harvested. And sorry, my slide wasn't going forward. So basically, with a lot of assistance from various people and agencies and organizations, we were able to sample forests across New England, in Vermont, New Hampshire, Western Massachusetts, and Connecticut in the summer of 2020. There was a range of land ownership represented, including state, federal, and private lands. About half of the sites had been harvested with EAB in mind, and the other half had not recently been harvested. So one quick thing to note about this map, each marker signifies a property, and some properties we sampled multiple stands, whereas others we just sampled one stand within a property. So out in the field, we found a variety of situations in terms of both ash health and also a variety in the treatments and management practices that had been applied in the harvested stands. So the main variable that we used to categorize these stands were the harvest approaches that we separated into treatment groups. So the unharvested or control group, again, which had not been harvested recently. And then within the harvested stands, we separated them into two categories: management approaches that prioritized ash removal from the landscape, often via phloem reduction or similar practices, and then approaches that prioritize ash regeneration and or retention on the landscape. So as you can see, most of the harvested stands fall into the removal group, and only a few that we sampled were classified as regeneration focused. So this graph shows the average number of seedlings per square meter for each treatment group for all species all the way on the left, and then for each of the 5 most prevalent overstory species in the understory. So as you can see, just in general, sugar maple seedlings made up the majority of all the seedlings that we found in terms of numbers. But you can also see the main differences between treatment groups for seedling density were that sugar maple seedlings, there were fewer in the, or less dense in the removal treatment compared to the control, whereas both white ash and yellow birch, the seedling density was higher in the removal treatment group compared to the control. And then looking at the same kind of layout with the species and the treatment groups, but now looking at saplings, the sapling stage density, the main patterns here were looking at all species together. There were more saplings in the regeneration group compared to either of the other two. And then for white ash, there were more saplings in both the regeneration and removal treatment groups, so both of the harvested groups compared to the control. And yellow birch, there were more also in the regeneration group compared to the control group for saplings. And then staying with the saplings size class, we also looked at the bigger picture of species composition per stand in this life stage. So this is the ordination plot resulting from non-metric multidimensional scaling, with each stand represented by a point on the plot. And the closer any 2 points are, the more similar their species composition. And the axes are numbered in order of decreasing importance, or how much of the variance in the data each axis explains. So looking at where the treatment groups fall within this ordination space, the plus signs denote the centroids of each group. So you can see that the 2 harvested groups, the removal and regeneration treatment groups, largely overlap, while the unharvested group is more distinct in terms of the overall sapling stage composition. So again, with only 4 stands in the regeneration group, it's hard to draw many conclusions about it. But just broadly, to go along with this analysis and visualization, we conducted a permanova or permutational multivariate analysis of variance and found that the composition of the unharvested group, the controlled group, was significantly different from each of the other two, the 2 harvested treatment groups, but they were not significantly different from each other in terms of the overall composition. Okay, so what does this all mean? So white ash regeneration was significantly impacted by emerald ash borer management harvests, but other species were as well. In both the seedling and the sapling stages, white ash was more prevalent in at least one of the harvest treatment groups compared to the unharvested stands. And most significant differences in regeneration were between the unharvested and harvested treatment groups. Fewer differences, we found fewer significant differences between the regeneration and removal harvest treatment groups. And thinking about a little bit about what this means for management, since that was one of the goals of looking at this. So if a goal for management is to encourage ash recruitment, then current ash management needs to consider the species regeneration needs, especially in terms of light availability. So when your goal is maintaining options for ash on the landscape, our results kind of support that, that higher light that ash may need as it develops. Just abstaining from harvesting altogether may not generate enough large enough gaps to recruit a new cohort of ash with that larger light availability. So kind of taking a hands-off approach, letting EAB kind of run its course and not cutting anything may not actually be the best case scenario for recruiting new ash if that is your goal. But this also presents an opportunity to link harvests that are creating those more favorable conditions for ash recruitment with other pest management approaches such as biological or chemical control, if the goal is to retain current ash and or recruit future ash. So I would like to thank my advisor, Tony D'Amato, and collaborator, Nate Siegert, as my co-authors, as well as many people who made this research possible, helped collect data. I couldn't have done it without all of them, and then also facilitated collecting data in all of those places during the pandemic in the summer of 2020. I definitely could not have done it without all of their help. And finally, thanks to you all for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions. Okay, thank you.
My name is Jimmy Stiles. I'm a PhD candidate at Auburn School of Forestry and Wildlife and the Environment. And I'm going to talk to you today about some research we're doing on the effects of fire treatments on Chinese privet. And the overall project is looking to restore Chinese privet infested hardwood bottomlands using fire. So a little background about Chinese privet for those of y'all not familiar with the plant. It's a highly invasive shrub, and as you can see in this picture, it forms these very thick monotypic stands and shades out all the ground cover plants underneath it. And then as the canopy trees fall down, they then are not replaced. And so it can form literally monotypic stands where nothing else is left except for the Chinese privet. So obviously that greatly threatens a lot of different biodiversity, not just the flora, but fauna as well. And Chinese privet came into the United States down in the southeastern U.S. in about the turn of the century. And then 1930s, it started to spread rapidly. There were actually government programs that gave out seed for people to plant all across their properties. And unfortunately now, here in Alabama, where my study site is, it now occupies over 1 million acres. So obviously in we're looking to get rid of Chinese privet and to try and restore the entire ecosystems that have been taken over with it. And currently all the control methods use herbicides. And there's been a lot of pushback from varying groups and landowners especially on the use of herbicides. And so we're looking for alternatives to be able to restore these ecosystems without the use of herbicides. So one of the ways that we figured would be best to do that is the use of fire. Prescribed fire is very common practice down here in the southeastern United States. Maybe less so in the bottomland hardwood systems as our pine stands, but it is historically a pretty prevalent occurrence in our landscape. And there is some anecdotal evidence that fire could control privet, but there is some evidence that it might be limited. Those successes might be limited. So our study site is a piece of private property owned by EBSCO Industries down along the Black Warrior River in Alabama. It's a beautiful river bottom hardwood and contains large stands of overly mature hardwood forests. And I should note that that floodplain, in particular, our study site floods annually or biannually. So on our study site, we arranged 4 different study sites, and each of those sites consist of 20 by 20 meter plots in strings of 10 along little woods roads for access, and treatments were randomly assigned. We had a prescribed fire only treatment, a prescribed fire with torch treatments, with the addition of torch treatments, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And 2 of those plots got 2 torch treatments a year. We also initiated a torch once annually with no prescribed fire and control plots. So all the plots were cut with chainsaws, and for the control plots, that was the only manipulations that were done. After the plots, all the privet was cut that was head high. That slash was allowed to dry, and then privet resprouts very readily once it's cut. And so we allowed the stumps to resprout before we did any of the treatments. And then we initiated our prescribed fire and torch treatments. So within each of those study plots, we had individual stumps that were marked. And in each plot, we marked 2 stumps of 5 different size classes. So a total of 10 stumps per plot. And those stems were then tracked throughout the study to assess both the growth and the mortality. For growth, what we did was count the number of each individual, or measure each of the individual resprouts coming off of the stump. So as far as the treatments go, prescribed fire was applied in January, between January and April in 2018 as part of another study to see what kind of burn conditions were needed to be able to conduct prescribed fires on the landscape. And then in 2019 and 2021, all the plots were burned on the same day under the same weather conditions. And we picked the best weather conditions conducive to carrying prescribed fire. And data collection was done on both the fire conditions as well as the percent of each plot that was burned. So Our torch treatments consist of using a backpack Red Dragon weed torch, and those treatments were conducted twice annually. So once in June and July, and once in September and October, except for the once annual torch treatments, which were done during the June and July torching. All stems within the plot were torched, and we, on average, treated the smaller stems for up to 10 seconds and 30 seconds for the larger stems. So as far as results with regards to the mortality, prescribed the top row and these lines represent the different treatments. And as you can see, the prescribed burn and the torch treatments started to kill the privet on the offset. And by the end of year 3, all of the privet in all of the plots had been killed. And the next effective method was the use of torch only, or torch once annually. And those treatments didn't start until a little bit later, right? At fall 2 is where you start to notice the those treatments effect, and it sort of mirrors the torching twice a year, but to a lesser degree. And then there was no significant difference between the controls and the prescribed fire as far as mortality goes. So when we look at the growth, which again was the measure of the length of the resprouts, again, from the beginning, the torch treatments and prescribed fire, torching twice a year with an addition of prescribed fire when it was possible, greatly reduced the growth. And you can see up there where we started the torch once a year, that's where that precipitous decline happens in the graph. And again, it is starting to drop down close to 0, which is where the torch treatments are at. And then again, you can see that the prescribed burn only plots, the growth was lower, it was decreased. And actually, this doesn't represent this current year's data, but I've been out at the plots recently, and we have an even more decreased growth. So we'll probably have a significant decrease in the amount of growth, but not necessarily the mortality of privet resprouts compared to controls. So a little bit of discussion. Prescribed fire can reduce the privet cover. However, its ability to actually control privet and restore the hardwood forests is limited. But the addition of backpack torch treatments greatly increased the efficacy of our restoration efforts and reduce the amount of time that it took to restore plots. And you know, again, one of the goals of this project was restoration. And while it's not represented in my presentation today, we are looking at how herbaceous native wildflowers and forbs and ground cover responded to the different treatment types. And no shocker, the torch treatment restoration sites have greatly increased floral diversity. So I would greatly like to thank EBSCO Industries for the lion's share of our funding and support. but all these other organizations and people lended invaluable support to the project that's been occurring for several years now. And with that, I'll take any questions.
I'm Kevin Potter from North Carolina State University, and I'm talking about how invaded or Hawaiian forests, overstory importance of non-native trees contrasts with understory dominance of non-native plants. And this is work that I've done with some folks from the U.S. Forest Service in Hawaii, FIA, Forest Inventory and Analysis on the West Coast, State of Hawaii, and the USDA NRCS. So a quick overview about Hawaii. As you no doubt know, Hawaii is a tropical volcanic island chain. It is the world's most isolated landmass. It has extensive environmental variability, which has turned it into an evolutionary cauldron with many endemic, rare, and endangered species. It is a global hotspot of species invasion, and that represents the most dominant threat to Hawaii ecosystems. So here Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest continental landmass, as well as the nearest island chains. Native Polynesians reached Hawaii 800 to 1700 years ago, have lived there since, and continue to be involved in the management and care of native ecosystems. In Hawaii, Europeans first arrived in the late 1700s with Captain James Cook from the UK. Most Hawaiian plants are found nowhere else in the world. 90% of its plants, in fact, are endemic, with many of those being endemic to a single island or mountain chain on a single island, which makes it, or which gives it the highest plant endemism of any floristic region in the world. So that it's really a fabulous place in terms of plant biodiversity, as well as other kinds of biodiversity. Not surprisingly, because of that, the biodiversity there and the limited extent of the landscape there, Hawaii encompasses many rare and endangered species. In fact, it has more than 400 endangered and threatened plant taxa, which makes up about half of all of US listed plant taxa under the Endangered Species Act. Only California has more, and California is 24 times larger. So Hawaii has become an invasive plant hotspot since the time of Captain Cook in the 1700s. At least 5,000 plant species have been introduced there. 1,500 approximately have naturalized, about 200 of those are very aggressive. Now, non-native plants, naturalized plants, make up more than half of the Hawaiian flora. Plants tend to be introduced in the tropical lowlands of Hawaii, and the impacts of the non-natives are extensive. They compete directly with native plants. They change soil properties, alter fire and hydrological processes, and then have cascading effects on wildlife as well as plant ecosystems. These are some of the worst characters in terms of trees. Unlike the continental United States, where we certainly have issues with non-native plants like Chinese privet, we do not have many aggressive tree species, invasive tree species, but Hawaii has several of these. One that we will see more of in this talk is strawberry guava from Brazil. So the objectives of this study were to use a statewide network of standardized forest plots to quantify the percent of Hawaiian forest trees that are non-native and the amount of invaded forests across the state, assess whether differences exist in non-native tree invasion between forest understory and canopy strata, and then determine whether forests and conservation management are less invaded than those that are not. So the data, the main data set for this study comes from the Forest Inventory and Analysis program of the U.S. Forest Service, really a remarkable program for those of you who are not familiar with it. Encompasses about 140,000 forested plots nationally, These are all fixed area plots, identical design, measured every 5 to 7 years in the east, every 10 years in the west. And the statistical design allows for aerial and tree count estimates because they are spatially unbiased in their location. The country is divided up into these hexagons with a plot located randomly within each of those. So each tree and plot condition represents a larger population or area. So it's really a fabulous statistical design in that way. The first complete measurement of plots was completed for Hawaii in 2015. So we're on the first set of data. Remeasurement is ongoing now. So we will be able to look at change detection in the coming years. So the data set we're using here encompasses 238 forested plots, most of them being on the Big Island, not a surprise, being the Big Island. And the plots were intersected with a number of spatial data sets, including ownership, fence status, climate, adaptive factors, population density, road density. We did a bunch of modeling involving several of these factors, but I won't have time to get into those results today. We were most interested in looking at the impact of ownership and management on the degree of invasion of forests in Hawaii. Where about 30% of the forests are owned or managed locally or by the state, about 16% federally. We also looked at reserved status. So these are on government-only plots or only on government plots, and these are forests that are not managed for wood products harvest. And we also looked at whether the forest was fenced or not. So fencing is a very important management tool in Hawaii to exclude the many non-native ungulates that have can have major impacts on forests, including spreading invasive plants, feral pigs being the most significant of those, and about 6% of the area of the state is fenced. So the FIA data are really nifty in that they allow you to take a look at differences by strata. So on the FIA plots, which encompass these four subplots arranged in a triangle, every large tree is measured on these subplots. Saplings are measured on the microplots within those subplots. Tree seedlings are counted within those as well. And then within each of these subplots, the percent cover of the four most common shrubs, forbs, and grasses are estimated, and then the percent cover of harmful invasive plant species are estimated on those as well. So in terms of how we classify species by their nativity, there are actually two ways to think about species nativeness in Hawaii. So we have endemic species. So these are species that occur nowhere else in the world. And then there are some indigenous species as well that occur elsewhere but are native to Hawaii. And then for non-native species, we divide these into Polynesian introduced species. So these are species of cultural importance brought to Hawaii by native Polynesians many years ago, versus species that we're just calling non-native, and these have been brought to Hawaii since the European arrival in the 18th century. So when we estimate the tree count of trees across Hawaii by nativity, and we look at large stems, we see first here that the large majority of large trees are about 70% are native, 2/3 of them being endemic, and about 30% are not native. And that's relatively good news. But when we go into the understory and we look at saplings and seedlings, we see that the story is almost reversed there, where only about 1/3 of saplings and seedlings are native versus about 2/3 being non-native and simply being not native, which certainly has implications for the future of the forest. Hawaii as well. When we look at the 10 most common species by count in the state, we find that 6 of them are not native. Strawberry guava is the most common tree in Hawaii. It's generally a small tree, so there aren't that many large examples of strawberry guava, but it is extensive and occurs in very dense stands. There are more strawberry guava stems than any other species. Ohia lehua is the most important native species in Hawaii, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So when we look at native tree importance value, we look on the Big Island. As we expected, you can see at lower elevations, the importance value of non-native species is higher than at higher elevations. But on the other islands, which tend not to get to such high elevation as the Big Island, non-native trees are important throughout. When we look at strawberry guava, we see that it tends toward low wet areas, so on the windward side of the Big Island, and on Maui, and then sort of widespread on some of the other islands. Brazilian pepper tree is another important non-native tree, tends toward mesic areas on the Big Island, Oahu, Maui, Lanai. Here we have Ohia lehua, the most important native tree in Hawaii. And we can see that its importance is much higher at higher elevations, especially on the Big Island, and to a lesser degree on Maui, Oahu, and Hawaii. So unfortunately, Ohia lehua is under threat from 2 non-native pathogens that together cause a disease called rapid ohia death that is causing 90% mortality in some stands. It's widespread on the Big Island and Kauai, and it is a major impact, or it's a major concern because of ohia's ecological and cultural importance. So when we look at the aerial extent of forested plant invasion across Hawaii, we can see that a little more than half of the forests have non-native trees. About 40% are dominated by non-native trees, and about a quarter of the understory cover is non-native. And as we look at island group, you can see moving from the Big Island toward the older islands further west, the amount of invasion increases, or the area of invasion. And as you move from higher elevation to lower elevation forest types, you see that same pattern. There's some good news here. When we look at management, forests that are in federal management are less invaded than those that are in state management, that are less invaded than those in private management. And that same pattern holds for reserved versus not reserved forest within a government management. So one last quick set of analyses here. We wanted to compare mean plot values between groups of plots by islands and management here. And again, we're using invasion metrics like importance value of large trees and saplings, the percent of seedlings, the percent cover of forbs, shrubs, and grasses on plots, and then comparing by island groups, forest types management, and fence status. So anywhere here where we have bold differences, where we have where the numbers here are bold, these are significant differences here. So as we move from again the Big Island toward the older islands, there's significantly more, or plots are significantly more invaded on average by large tree, small tree, percent seedling count, but not, interestingly, for grasses. So the percent of non-native grasses is higher on the Big Island than other places. And we see a similar pattern as we go from higher to lower elevation forest types as well. When we look at trees, not so much with shrubs and vine cover. And when we look at invadedness by ownership and management here, again, this seems to be pretty good news. So plots on average in federal ownership are less invaded than those that are in state, than those that are in private ownership. And there's definitely a significant difference between fenced and non-fenced status for forests as well. So to summarize, forest understories in Hawaii are more invaded than the canopies, and that's a concern because disturbance events and natural mortality could lead to increases in canopy invasion over time, especially with rapid ohia death, for example. There seems to be a continuum of invadedness from lower elevations to higher elevations and from older to younger islands. Forests and conservation and management are less invaded. That may tell us that public ownership, reserved land, ungulate exclusion may be effective. However, that difference may also be the result of better starting conditions. So places that are more, that have higher ecological integrity are more likely to be preserved. And then, you know, invasion may be proceeding apace in those, but they may have been better off to start with. So that's something to research further. Does that invasion continuum suggest an invasion trajectory? So as we move from lower to higher elevations and from older to younger islands, are those forests moving along a trajectory toward a point where they'll all be equally invaded? How will rapid ohia death affect high elevation forests in terms of an invasion over time? And the remeasured FIA data may help us to address those questions. So appreciate funders and field crew folks for all the work they did, and I appreciate your time. If we have questions, or if we have time for questions, I'll be happy to answer those.